morning, welcome back to the Genius Maltby channel. It's time for another stroll down memory lane, a walk through history. Some of the subjects that we'll cover today we've covered at different times in other videos. If you remember, we've covered the history of the word dollar, and a lot of that video covered where the dollar came from. Today's presentation is from the Visual Capitalist. A lot of good material comes off this site. We've done some really good videos and discussions based on their visual presentations of debt, the total supply of certain metals, and so on. This one here, 31 fascinating facts on the early history of the US dollar. This is a cool article, cool subject matter. I always like these bits of history and the visuals, little reminders here and there of certain facts we may have forgotten, and then there's always something new that we learn. And when you're holding a coin in your hand or a piece of currency, you can remember some of these little tidbits. They make for interesting barbecue or dinner time conversations for those of you out there that wish to start up and sneak in there some economics conversation when everyone else is talking about sports or something. Well, before the dollar, there still was a continent, and there was a continent full of people that needed to transact for goods and services. So before the dollar, during colonial times in British America, being that this was a British colony, it's obvious and it makes sense that they would have used cash denominated using the pound sterling. So pounds, shillings, pence, crowns, half crowns, the coins that we've recently been discussing a bit more here on the Genius Maltby channel. Some colonies tried to issue their own fiat paper currencies, usually to pay debts or for funding war. Adam Smith criticized these in his most famous work, The Wealth of Nations. He said the inflationary nature of colonial bills of credit was a violent injustice, unquote, to the creditor, and that the system was, quote, a scheme of fraudulent debtors to cheat their creditors, unquote. Physical cash was often scarce, and in the colonies, it's true that commodities like tobacco, beaver skins, and wampum all served as money at various times and places. Because so few coins were minted, foreign coins like the Spanish dollar or the 8 reals pillar dollar became widely circulated in the colonies. And this is one of the reasons why I so much enjoy coinage. I mean, you look at that image of a Spanish dollar, and you have this connection when you're holding coins, when you read things like this, if you're perusing a history book or discussing a particular time period in history. I often remind friends and others that one of the only tangible things we can hold or have that's connected to time periods like this is coinage, because it's so durable and it's lasted so long through the centuries. So when you're holding a pillar dollar, when you're holding any of the old currencies, the old monies from old Europe, like a Joachimsthaler or an early American dollar, you're holding these pieces that have been handed down through the ages and transacted for goods and services, and the story behind each one of these coins is most often unknown. We don't know where it went, who carried it, what drawer it was stuffed in, what vault it was locked away in, where it was hidden, what nefarious activities it was part of, who it may have helped out. You know, it might have been a coin that someone desperately needed to pay off some debt or to purchase some food or goods and services for their family or a loved one. So these pieces of history that you hold, these coins, they're interesting. And I hope when everyone holds an old coin that that's something they think about, something they look at or ponder when they're holding it. I mean, just that story, that connection. It's pretty awesome. The prevalence of the Spanish dollar led to U.S. money eventually being denominated in dollars rather than pounds. Now, if you remember, we covered the story of the U.S. dollar, the history and the origins of the word. And as you may remember, it dates back to the name Joachimsthaler or a Tolar from the coins, the big silver coins that were in Europe at the time, mainly from the Germanic regions. And you know, this is a time period in human history, this colonial period when the world was being explored and colonized and trade was spanning the globe from Asia to Europe to North America, to South America, to Africa, that I honestly, I try to argue this point that there was almost, you could say, a world currency. There was almost a one world currency. And all you have to do to realize it is if you have the coins present, lay them out. If you don't have them, look them up. Look up the Joachimsthaler, the Tolar coins. Look up the Spanish 8 reals, the pillar dollar. Look up the British, the crown coins, the 1 crown, full crown silver coin, and then the early American silver dollar, as well as the larger silver coins that were coming out of other nations around the world. And you'll see that a lot of them were around, that 26, 27, 28 grains of silver. They were mutually exchanged and acceptable. A lot of them were considered to be of almost the same value just due to the weight and purity and size of those silver coins. And so you could almost say we did have a world currency at this time. We had a typical common exchange rate of silver for gold that was somewhat averaged around the world. And then you had these large silver coins that were traded for goods and services and circulating at the same time alongside each other in all of these different nations and around the world. So you could almost say we had a one world currency, and the base unit was these large silver coins. These, whether you want to call them a dollar, a Tolar, or a crown, there was a silver coin that circulated the world as currency. During the American Revolution in 1775, the Continental Congress issued paper money, known as Continental currency, to help fund the war effort. The government overprinted Continentals to pay for the war, and their value diminished rapidly. After 5 years of runaway inflation, a Continental was worth just 2.5% of its face value. This is where we get the phrase, not worth a Continental. Benjamin Franklin also noted that the depreciation of the Continental had, in effect, acted as a tax to pay for the war. I hope you guys can remember this theme here, that war and government spending often, almost always, leads to depreciation of the currency, inflation, and the destruction of that currency over time. The recent experience of the failure of the Continental and paper currency, as well as their knowledge of history and the failures of fiat currencies in the past, the founding fathers were discussing the very issue of paper currency, debt, and fiat when they drafted the Constitution. And we read here that the failure of the Continental was at the top of their minds during the writing of the Constitution. In fact, a clause was created to make sure such a fiasco would never happen again. And this is where we read, under Article 1, Section 10, that the states were not permitted to coin money, emit bills of credit, or make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Now, how they get away with not doing that and the absolute violation of the Constitution, because our money today is, by this definition, unconstitutional, is beyond me. The birth of the U.S. dollar. The Coinage Act of 1792 created the U.S. dollar as a standard unit of currency, established the U.S. Mint, and regulated coinage. Martha Washington is depicted in the picture on the right there. It's by John Dunsmore, inspecting the first coins. Legend has it that the silver for the coin came from the Washington family silverware. The act pegged the value of the U.S. dollar to the widely used Spanish silver dollar. And as I've reported in the past, perhaps my favorite part of the Coinage Act, the law, was that it also established a penalty of death for debasing gold or silver coins authorized by the act. I think if we brought this law back and enforced it, we might see a return of a more sound money supply here in the United States, as every coin currently in circulation has been thoroughly debased. 100% of their metal content is worthless, cupro-clad nickel garbage. Foreign coins from Great Britain, Portugal, France, and Spain were still accepted as legal tender as late as 1857. So this goes back to my point that there really was almost a one world currency. Imagine if in America today you could exchange euros, British pound notes, or coins for that matter, made of precious metal, coins from Portugal, France, and Spain throughout the United States. Go to the grocery store, you could purchase anything you wanted as long as the coins you were using to exchange for these goods and services contained a specified weight and purity of precious metal. Now, this was an interesting piece of trivia that I actually learned today. I might have heard this in the past, but I completely forgot it until I read it here again. And that's the origins of the word buck. The slang for a dollar, buck, is derived from when the hide of a male deer, or a buck, was often traded in the Great Lakes area for the price of $1, or a buck. From Henry Howe's 1851 Historical Collections of Ohio, we read, "A muskrat skin was equal to $1/4, a raccoon skin $1/3, a doe skin $1/2, and a buckskin the almighty dollar." From the 1830s to the 1860s, during a period of little banking rules, thousands of state banks issued their own paper currencies. They were beautiful, but worthless due to their unaccountability. They are now known as broken banknotes. Either they forgot how to hang people or the hangman's noose was broken. Looks like they should have been hanging a whole lot of people back between 1830 and 1860, and perhaps they could have avoided such an issue. Before the war, there were as many as 10,000 different kinds of paper money in circulation. The Civil War. Wars cost money. At this time, it was not very feasible for the federal government to acquire the hodgepodge of different banks' notes necessary to pay massive war expenses. Now, if you can, when this is completed, this video, there are several other videos in the archives, if you go to the history section, that talk about this time period and have a little bit more in-depth analysis of not only the greenbacks issued by Lincoln. You'll find some in-depth coverage on that with the article titled "The Federal War on Gold," but also just some of the other history we cover within that playlist. Recently, we even discussed panic, like it's 1837, discussing the panic of 1830s with currency and precious metals at that time period in American history. The $10 demand note was the first official paper currency pressed in 1861 to finance the Civil War. Coinage was in short supply at this time, so the government started printing the first ever fractional notes. These were notes denominated in like 10 cents or 50 cents, 25 cents. Now, an interesting piece of trivia that's not included here in this brief description of this time period is the reason why coinage was in short supply at this time. Well, there was a war going on, and people back then were, well, they knew what happened with war, and they were fairly educated in the issuance of paper currency and the value of precious metals. So they hoarded precious metals. One story I remember reading was that a gentleman in the northern region, I believe it was New York City, hoarded so much coinage, silver and gold, must have been a wealthy individual, that it caused a structural problem in the building he was hoarding it in. Supposedly a floor collapsed in the room that he was stowing barrels of silver and gold coinage. Now, with coinage being hoarded out of existence, they were forced to then issue these paper fractional reserve currency notes. The North also began paying bills with a new fiat currency known as the greenback. It is not backed by anything. It is worth what it says it is worth because the government says so. It's legal tender. This is where legal tender laws in the United States originate from, and I would encourage you, again, to look up the Federal War on Gold reading of that article here on this channel in the archives when this video is complete for more in-depth discussion on that very topic. The Confederacy also issued paper money during the Civil War, worth around $1 billion, more than double the amount circulated by the United States. Confederate money was only redeemable after ratification of a peace treaty, making it worthless by the time they lost the war in 1865. "In God We Trust" was first used on coins during the Civil War and was eventually added to all coins in 1955. Around this time, counterfeiting was a widespread problem, with greenbacks and all the private notes that were circulating. More than a third of these bills were fake at the time. In the early 19th century, counterfeiting would often occur north of the border in British Canada, where criminals could operate with impunity. Sophisticated counterfeit bills were made by skilled artisans. In fact, some bank engravers would moonlight as counterfeiters, often using the same dies and plates used to print genuine banknotes. The Secret Service was formed in 1865 to tackle the counterfeiting problem. The 1883 Liberty Head nickel did not originally have the word cents inscribed on it. Scammers illegally gold-plated these coins and passed them off as $5 coins. Counterfeiting measures have come a long way since the late 19th century. Today, it's estimated that less than 0.01% of notes are fake. That doesn't take away from the fact that they are just printed fiat paper, and essentially that's the same thing as counterfeit. It's nothing to back it, it's just printed at will by somebody else. And, you could almost argue that the circulating paper we have now is indeed counterfeit. It's not represented by anything real or tangible. They've already violated the clause in the Constitution we discussed in the very beginning of this video by not emitting anything but coins struck in gold and silver as tender in payment of debts. Well, there you go. That's a brief history and discussion. Covered several points there regarding the history and the origins of the U.S. dollar. Some of it was review, but I did learn a thing or two from this article today, and it's always interesting just looking back in history. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's channel program, this discussion here on the Junior Small P channel. If you did, go ahead and hit the like, thumbs up button there. Don't forget to share and subscribe if you're not subscribed already. And again, this video will be part of a playlist. I'll put it in there so you can explore other videos related to this very topic and some of the subjects here that we discussed today.